In 1838, a newspaper in Charleston, South Carolina, printed a reward notice for a man named George. Approximately 30 years of age, medium height, 2 letters burned into his left hand, his enslaver's initials. They had been placed there deliberately after the first time George had run. He ran again anyway. Notices like George's fill American newspapers from the colonial period straight through to 1865. And they are among the most chilling documents in the historical record, not because they describe something exceptional, but because of how utterly routine and businesslike they managed to sound. What those notices, court records, plantation ledgers, and the testimony of survivors recorded decades later reveal about what really happened to enslaved people caught trying to escape is a story that American history has been quietly underreporting for a very long time.
The advertisements ran in newspapers across state lines, reprinted in city papers and county gazettes alike, because the network tasked with returning escaped enslaved people stretched across the entire South, and after 1850, into the North as well. Bounty hunters, constables, ordinary white citizens, all were legally entitled to claim reward money for returning anyone described within them. The architecture of recapture was not improvised. It was built, funded, maintained, and continuously refined across 2 centuries. Understanding it requires understanding the system that made escape both desperately necessary and almost impossibly dangerous. By the early 19th century, every Southern state had codified what were known as slave codes, detailed bodies of law governing every aspect of an enslaved person's existence. These codes specified what an enslaved person could own, where they could travel, what they could say in court, and crucially, what could legally be done to them when they ran. The codes did not leave punishment to chance or to the individual rage of an enslaver. They specified, they categorized, they assigned particular consequences to particular offenses, in the same dry administrative language used to regulate trade or property taxes. The brutality was not a failure of the system, it was the system functioning precisely as intended. Historian Sally E. Hadden, who studies slave patrols, law, and violence in Virginia and the Carolinas, remains the most thorough examination of the organized patrol apparatus, documented how Southern states established formalized slave patrols as early as 1704 in South Carolina. These were not informal mobs. They were legally constituted bodies paid from public funds authorized by statute to patrol roads at night, stop and interrogate any black person traveling without a written pass, search enslaved people's quarters without warning, and administer physical punishment on the spot. An enslaved person encountered by a patrol without documentation could be whipped immediately, without trial, without any formal hearing. The patrol administered the prescribed number of lashes and moved on. This was not extra-legal violence. It was the law working exactly as designed. Enslaved people called these patrollers the paddy rollers, and the terror their nighttime appearances generated was one of the most consistently documented features of plantation life across every Southern state. What happened when someone was caught depended on how far they had gotten, how many times they had tried, and what statement the enslaver decided needed to be made. Edward Baptist, in The Half Has Never Been Told, documented through plantation records and survivor testimony how the escalating system of punishment was deliberately calibrated to serve as both personal retribution and public warning. A first escape attempt typically brought severe whipping, the number of lashes depending on state law and the enslaver's judgment, followed by surveillance, restricted movement, and sometimes the fitting of an iron collar. These were heavy metal bands locked around the neck, sometimes with bells attached so the wearer's movements could always be heard, sometimes with protruding metal prongs so that sleeping in anything but an upright position became impossible. These collars appear repeatedly in runaway slave advertisements of the period, described as matter-of-factly as a jacket or a scar. Branding was another documented punishment for repeat escape attempts. A hot iron formed into a letter, sometimes R for runaway, sometimes the enslaver's own initials, was pressed into the skin of the hand, the cheek, or the chest. It served a dual function. It punished, and it permanently marked the body in a way that made future escape harder, turning physical appearance itself into a kind of walking wanted notice. Runaway slave advertisements from Virginia, Georgia, and Louisiana frequently describe men and women with brand marks, noted alongside height, age, and clothing, in the same dispassionate inventory language used for livestock. In some states, the law went further still. Virginia's slave codes, along with those of several other southern states listed, ear cropping, the removal of part or all of one ear as a sanctioned punishment for a first or second escape attempt, depending on the jurisdiction and period. Court records from colonial Virginia document this punishment being carried out in public, in town squares used for other legal proceedings in front of gathered witnesses. Like branding, it served two purposes simultaneously. It punished, and it permanently altered the body in a visible way that made the person easier to identify, easier to describe in a newspaper notice, harder to move through public spaces unnoticed. Some accounts in the WPA Slave Narratives, the testimonies of formerly enslaved people collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, also describe the deliberate cutting of tendons at the back of the leg, intended to prevent someone from ever running again. Historians approach these accounts carefully, since corroborating documentation is difficult to establish with consistency. But the fact that they appear in survivor testimonies at all speaks to the scale of what people feared and what some of them witnessed. There was a punishment that many formerly enslaved people in those same Federal Writers Project testimonies described as worse than any physical suffering: being sold south. Being sold deeper into the cotton and sugar plantations of Mississippi, Alabama, or Louisiana, where mortality rates were among the highest in the entire hemisphere, and where an enslaved person knew almost no one. Being sold away from spouses, parents, and children. A person caught running in Virginia might find themselves days later on a boat heading somewhere they had never been, knowing no one, cut off from every human relationship they had spent their life building. The threat of sale was used constantly and deliberately as a mechanism of control. It weaponized family love itself, turning the people an enslaved person cared most about into the most effective reason not to run. And when that threat was carried out as punishment for a failed escape, it accomplished something no whip or brand could achieve alone. It ensured that everyone who witnessed the separation understood exactly what another attempt would cost. Harriet Jacobs, who spent 7 years hidden in a tiny crawl space above her grandmother's house in North Carolina before finally escaping north, described in her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, the specific grinding calculation of what running meant for an enslaved woman with children. She could not simply go. She had to weigh every hour of her own freedom against what would happen to the people she left behind. Her enslaver used her children as his most effective chain. It was not metaphorical. When they were endangered or threatened, it was a direct communication about the price of her continued absence. Jacobs survived. She escaped. But the years she spent in that crawl space, unable to stand upright, unable to reveal herself even to her own children for years at a time, give some specific human measure of what freedom cost and what recapture would have meant. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 extended this entire apparatus north of the Mason-Dixon line. Under its provisions, federal commissioners in free states were required to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. Northern citizens could be legally compelled to participate in capture efforts. An enslaved person who had escaped to Boston, to Philadelphia, to New York, building a new life over years or even decades, could be seized and returned south. Free black people in the North lived under constant threat of kidnapping, since the law placed the burden of proof heavily on the accused, and fraudulent claims against legally free individuals were documented and largely unpunished. The 1850 Act made the entire continental United States, in the words of Frederick Douglass, a hunting ground for enslaved people. There was no safe distance anymore. There was no line that once crossed meant freedom was secure. What this system built across the decades of its operation was something that outlasted abolition itself. Sally Hadden and other historians of American law have traced a direct institutional line from the slave patrol apparatus to the organized police forces that emerged in southern cities and states during and after Reconstruction. The patrol model, publicly funded, legally authorized to stop and confront black individuals without specific cause, empowered to administer immediate consequences, became embedded in the foundational structures of American law enforcement. This is not a speculative claim. It is a documented institutional history traced through legislative records, municipal charters, and the professional lineages of police organizations established in cities like Charleston, New Orleans, and Savannah in the decades following abolition. the specific shape of modern American policing, and the specific tensions that still gather around race and law enforcement today cannot be fully understood without this history sitting at the center of it. As historians continue to work through the vast archive of plantation records, court documents, runaway slave advertisements, Freedmen's Bureau files, and the survivor testimonies gathered in the 1930s, our picture of exactly how this system operated continues to deepen and occasionally to shift. What seems clear, and what new scholarship continues to reinforce rather than revise, is that the system was not chaotic or accidental. It was engineered. It was documented. It was maintained through institutions, laws, and public money, administered with the same bureaucratic deliberateness used to manage roads or tax collection. And it was resisted constantly by people who understood its logic completely and chose to run anyway, knowing precisely what capture would mean. The act of running was not desperate or irrational. Under the circumstances, it was one of the most rational and courageous things a human being could do. So when those newspaper notices described George 30 years of age, 2 initials burned into his left hand, running for the second time after already paying the price of a first attempt, they were describing something the notices themselves could not quite contain. A man who had weighed the cost, paid it once, and decided it was still worth paying again. The truth that history books most consistently sanitize is not only how brutal the punishment was, it is how completely and stubbornly it failed to stop the running.